Everybody, thank you very much for another night at the pigsty. Tonight we are joined by Praise and Jeff. We are going to have a debate. It's going to be on the first, who is the authorship of 1 Timothy. So everybody, thank you very much for coming, and we will just run straight into the intro, and yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like action movie preview music.
Exactly, doesn't it, Jeff? Because we just went live as you said that. So, as I said earlier, people, we are here tonight to discuss the authorship of 1 Timothy. I don't know if anybody knows the backstory behind this, but Jeff has had this debate before. He went up against the amazing Gavin, and Praise felt that Gavin didn't do a good enough job, so he decided to step up and take the mark. So what we'll do is we'll go to Jeff first. Jeff, if you want to introduce yourself and let people know exactly who you are.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jefferson Spachcock. I have a YouTube channel. Just discuss basic stuff, religious issues, Bible studies, biblical history, and lots of atheism stuff, plus lots of random crazy ranting and messing around, wasting time. So,
yeah, 8-hour streams. What the fuck do you have to talk about for 8 hours? Praise, if you'd like to go on ahead and let everyone know exactly who you are and where to find you.
Yeah, my name is Praise. I go by Praise I Am That I Am. It's from Exodus 3:14, where God says, I am that I am, so I'm trying to venerate his name there. But my channel just consists mostly of apologetics, trying to defend arguments that skeptics like to bring against the faith, and that just really sums it up pretty much. I do debates. I love doing debates. That's a favorite of my things to do. So I appreciate the invite here to engage with Jeff.
No, yeah, well, definitely welcome, man. You know, debates, as I said to you before we were online, we're hoping to get more going here in the channel. We're hoping to do more down that line. So thank yous. I have to say thank yous both for picking me and using me as a platform. I do appreciate it. The way we're going to go for tonight is as best as I can. I'm basically not going to say a goddamn thing. We're both adults here, all adults here. We have a bit of respect for each other. We're going to go with opening statements. Praise is going to go first. Beforehand, both sides have had the citations, so we have a rough idea of where we're coming from. We are then going to move into rebuttal. After the rebuttal, then we are going to have an open hangout, sort of between the two of them, open discussion. Praise will lead the conversation first, and then Jeff will lead it afterwards, and then we'll go into questions and answers. Post your questions as you go, but do make sure to tag me, because I won't fucking see you if you don't fucking tag me. So, yeah. Other than that, I will take a back step. I will hand over to Praise. Praise, go on ahead, my man. The floor is yourself.
Awesome. So firstly, I want to thank MathPig for taking his time out to host this debate, and Jefferson for engaging in this conversation with me. A few things I want to point out before I get in the heart of the matter. Firstly, it is universally accepted the authorship of the Pastoral Epistles are ascribed to Paul. So the burden of proof is exponentially magnified for my opponent and skeptics alike to provide a robust case why these epistles are pseudepigraphical. Secondly, there is great internal evidence Paul is the author of Timothy. For example, 1 Timothy 1:12 through 14, where the author describes himself in his pre-Christian life as being a blasphemer and a persecutor and a violent man. This is certainly congruent with what we know about the pre-conversion Paul from the book of Acts. He was a blasphemer and persecutor in that he denied the deity of Christ and persecuted believers in Christ vehemently. He was present at the stoning of Stephen and continually sought to bring believers to death. Acts 7:58, Acts 9:1 through 2. These circumstances align quite well with the statements of the author of the epistles. For example, the salutations of the pastorals follow the pattern found in his other compositions. The author begins by introducing himself as an apostle chosen by God. Example, Romans 1:1, 1 Corinthians 1:1. Then after addressing the recipients, he extends a blessing of grace and peace, as he does in all of his letters. Moreover, the multitude of personal references found in the Pastoral suggest Pauline authorship and authenticity of the letters. Throughout the epistles, the author mentions numerous individuals which he had contact during his activity and travels, 1 Timothy 1:20. He names Hymenaeus and Alexander as false teachers, and in Titus 3:12, he asked Titus to join him once Artemis and Dochicas arrives to replace him. He also names two other fellow workers, Apollos, Zenas, the lawyer. This is in Timothy 3:12 through 13. In 2 Timothy, the writer refers to Timothy's mother and grandmother, Eunice and Lois, 1 Timothy 1:5. And he blesses Onesiphorus for his kindness to him at Rome at Ephesus, 1 Timothy 16 through 18. In the letter to the Philippians, Paul addresses the saints churched together with the overseers and deacons, 1 Timothy 1:1. In the letters to the Philippians, I'm sorry, that's Philippians 1:1. And together with the overseers and deacons, how could Paul have mentioned such officials if they were not contemporaries with Paul? In addition, there are occasions in the New Testament where Paul is described as anointing and interacting with overseers and elders in various churches, Acts 14:23, 20, 28. Furthermore, on pages 159 through 160 in Stephen P. Dre's book From Consensus to Chaos, an historical analysis of evangelical interpretation of 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15 from 1945 to 2001, he points out the pseudepigraphal viewpoint of the pastoral epistles was largely a secular movement, which calls into question the level of inspiration, revelation of these secular scholars. Wilder, in his book Pseudonymity in the New Testament on page 326, notes the Pauline authorship of the pastorals was not seriously questioned until the 19th century. By the end of the 2nd century, the second pastoral epistles were firmly established as scripture, and no one questioned their authenticity until the 19th century. Eusebius declared that they were universally received in ancient Christianity, saying that Paul's 14 epistles are well known and undisputed, as Gordon Fee indicates in his commentary. Paraphrasing from Brandon Carter's paper, The Authorship of the Pastoral Epistles, he lays out several aspects of textual criticism that confirms Pauline authorship of the Pastoral Epistles. He says the conundrum with the pseudonymity is that the early church, both in the lifetime of Paul and in the patristic period, strongly opposed such false writings. The people of the first century were concerned with problems of literary fraud, and David Mead says by the Christian era, ancient critics had developed literary tools for exposing forgeries, not unsimilar to the techniques today. Terry Wilder and Philip Towner point out, while it has been documented that instances of pseudonymity were acceptable in Greco-Roman and Jewish cultures, early Christians did not endorse the practice. There is evidence for this in Paul's letters. In 2 Thessalonians 2:2, the apostle warns the readers to beware of letters and teachings that have supposedly come from him. Paul also guarantees the authenticity and the authority of his letter to the Galatians by pointing to the evidence that parts of, in fact, were written by his own hand. Galatians 6:11. The apostle had approved of the letter, and it was important for the recipients of both of these letters to realize that they were the words of the apostle himself. Paul Towner adds, while the pastoral epistles were generally accepted, and letters claiming Pauline authorship were found to be inauthentic, were consistently rejected. This shows the criteria for Pauline authorship was rigorous and strict. An example of such occurrence is found in the writings of Tertullian. On the baptism, 200 AD, he describes an elder who had falsely written under the name of Paul. The elder had apparently done so in an attempt to increase Paul's fame because of his love for the apostle. However, because of this pseudonymic writing, the elder was removed from his office. And lastly, Terry Wilder expounds upon this by saying, even if a pseudepigraphic work does not contradict an apostle's teaching, it is still deceptive because it was written without approval. Stanley Porter, in his publications Implications for the Canon, makes the point that pastoral epistles were not accepted for their lack of pseudonymity, but for their authenticity. George W. Knight III argues that the self-testimony of the pastoral epistles makes clear in each introduction of the author, in fact, the apostle, and extensive personal allusions that permeate each letter that substantiate the claim. Thusly, it is unambiguously clear that Paul is not only the author of Timothy, but the pastoral epistles. With that, I yield my time.
Sorry, I was muted. Jeff, our praise, thank you very much for your opening statement. That was nearly 10 minutes. We went 7.
Thank you.
Jeff, the floor is yours, man.
Okay, well, thank you again for having me on, and yeah, I'll get started. So I'll just start with an introduction. I'm going to do kind of the same thing I did before. I'm going to give an overview because I think it's good for the general audience. So I just want to present some background information about kind of the environment that these were written in, and just some basic facts. So there are 27 books in the New Testament, 13 of which are the Pauline epistles, combined with Hebrews, which has traditionally been attributed to Paul, and it actually owes its inclusion into the canon based on that attribution. The books of Acts, along with the books of Acts, Paul's a very central character of 15 books of the New Testament. However, out of the 13 letters, despite the fact that they all claim to be written by Paul directly, they make up what's known as the Pauline corpus. 7 of those are considered undisputed letters. They are autonomous documents, meaning they claim to be written by Paul, and modern critical scholars accept and attest that this is factually accurate. So no problems there. They include 1 Thessalonians, which is chronologically the oldest book, the first book of the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans. So those are rough chronological order there. The remaining 6 epistles form 2 groups of disputed letters, and these are the letters where there's a lot of scholarly divide about authorship. The first set consists of the Deutero-Pauline epistles, which includes 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. The second set features 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Those are the pastoral epistles. Amongst these 6 letters, they share the most scholarly consensus of having not been written by Paul. So for the purpose of this debate, we're focusing on 1 Timothy, although more than likely, especially during the exchange, we'll probably bring up other aspects of inconsistencies that scholars have pointed out in the other disputed letters. Forgeries. One of the most controversial claims that can be made to Christians is the suggestion that there are books within the Bible whose authorship is falsely ascribed. We know of writings left outside the canon that were forgeries, that is, written in Paul's name. We have a 3rd letter to the Corinthians, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and the letters of Paul from writers, the letters of Paul and Seneca. Forgeries were common in the ancient world, and the proof of this comes from writers throughout the era who attested to the practice and warned their readers about it. The ancient physician Galen wrote a book dedicated to informing his readers how they could know for certain whether they were reading something authentically from him. We even have proof from the Bible that forgeries were a concern. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, now concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together to him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by a spirit or spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. This prompts the question, since forgeries were so common during this historical period, what are the chances that pseudepigraphal writings became canonized? It turns out, according to the consensus of modern critical scholars, very good. We can see that there is a precedent for pseudepigraphal writings, but it's a very different thing to say that there were forgeries in the ancient world and in general, and then to say that there are forgeries within the Bible. 1st and 2nd Peter serve as solid evidence for the second claim. They were almost definitely not written by the Apostle Peter, and most scholars acknowledge this fact. Biggest reason being, Peter was illiterate. But even proof of other pseudepigraphal writings within the Bible is not necessarily evidence in and of itself that any of Paul's writings were dishonestly ascribed. So what makes scholars think that the pastoral epistles are pseudepigraphal? Let's see here. So the first category would be writing style and vocabulary. And this one frequently comes up and is probably one of the most hotly contested. Indications that scholars began to have doubts regarding the authenticity of authorship of the pastoral epistles, and 1 Timothy in particular, were apparent in the early 19th century and possibly as early as the 1700s. It was argued then, and still is now, that the vocabulary and ideas expressed were at odds with those found in the other letters of Paul. According to A.N. Harrison, there are 848 different words used in the pastoral letters, and 306, over one-third of them, do not occur in any other Pauline letter. Two-thirds of those 306 words are used by second-century Christian writers. Words in common between 1 Timothy and the undisputed Pauline epistles often have a different relationship, as in faith in Christ. In 1 Timothy, the meaning of faith seems to be the body of Christian teaching, which is to say, the faith. They also differed on the notion of works. Hang on a second here. This is messing up. They also differed on the notion of works. While it's generally accepted by scholars that Paul's meaning of works refers to deeds fulfilling Jewish law, 1 Timothy uses the word works in the sense of doing good deeds. So there's a little bit of a theological difference there. And that brings us into theological differences in general. 1 Timothy contains different ideas regarding marriage, women, and soteriology. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul emphasized that people should remain single. He does not condemn marriage, but he prefers that people devote themselves solely to God. However, in 1 Timothy, to assume a leadership role in the church, a bishop or deacon, terms that Paul uses in the undisputed letters, but not in the same way, those individuals must be married in order to be appointed. As for women, they would be saved by, quote, bearing children. Both concepts are unusual ideas from an apostle that believed the end of time was coming soon. He also establishes with the letter a patriarchal hierarchy for the family and the church, which is at odds with his previous stated views of marriage, but also his statement, there is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. The more sophisticated, rigid church organization described in 1 Timothy is solid evidence that the letter is more accurately dated later in the first century, probably after Paul's death. We also have anachronisms. So the historical setting described in 1 Timothy includes descriptions of false teaching, which includes myths and genealogies and advocation for ascetic practices, such as abstinence from sex and certain types of foods. These descriptions match the practices and teachings of early Gnostic groups that arose around the end of the first century, after Paul's ministry would have ended. The reason for his ministry's end was that tradition holds that Paul likely died in the late 60s of the first century, toward the end of the reign of Nero. In 1 Clement, written around 95 CE, it states that Paul's death occurred during Nero's persecutions of Christians. So one of the simplest reasons for Paul not being the author of 1 Timothy is that he was dead before it was ever written. So these three areas of criticism, differences in writing style and vocabulary usage, variations and even contradictions in theological concepts, and references to issues and events likely past the point of Paul's lifetime, provide the most evidence against Pauline authorship of 1 Timothy, as well as the two other pastoral epistles. These inconsistencies are why many scholars believe that the pastoral epistles were written by a later author who used Paul's name to bolster the authority of his own message. And with that, I yield my time.
Perfect. That was near enough 7 minutes as well, man. So that was bang on. He's both worked out the same. So, Praise, we will now bounce to you. If we can focus, what we're going to do now is a rebuttal. So, having Jeff fresh in your memory, if you can rebuttal what Jeff said, then Jeff will rebuttal you. If we can remain silent during the rebuttal for any problems that we have on either side, take a note, write it down, and we get to the opening statement, we can attack it there and then. So, Praise, again, I'll pass to you, my man.
Awesome. So I want to address a couple of things what Jeff brought up. I think it's an irrelevant issue that the majority of scholars today, which I would say are secular scholars, affirm the non-Pauline scholarship, or authorship of the pastoral epistles, because for the other 19 centuries, it was firmly Pauline authorship. So I think that, to me, is an irrelevant issue. And even if we grant you that is the case, still the majority of evangelicals still hold to that. So if it comes to the point, well, just because they're authorities, does that mean it's true? No. It's to become at that point, it becomes an appeal to an authority fallacy at that point. Now I want to get to some of these other points that Jeff mentioned as well, as literary differences and supposedly these literary differences in the pastoral epistles compared to Paul's other well-famed epistles that are firmly grounded in all scholarship. Well, Percy Harrison is an opponent of Pauline authorship of Timothy. He acknowledges that there are fewer than 20 words used in the pastorals that were not used widely among writers before AD 90 to 93. In addition, about 80 of the 176 hapax legoma. So I don't know if people know what that is. The hapax legoma is a word used only one time in a document or corpus. And in the pastorals, we find these in the Septuagint. So if these words were so misused, like they were incongruent with Paul at that time, well, then why are these found in the Septuagint? These two facts demonstrate there is no reason to say that the words employed in the epistles were not part of Paul's vocabulary. Moreover, upon the comparison of the calculation of the percentage of the hapax legoma per book on each of the books written by Paul and now the pastorals, it's noticeable that the numbers for 2 Timothy and Titus are very close to that of Romans. This evidence does a great deal of damage to the theory that the epistles must have been written in the 2nd century on the basis of vocabulary, as George Knight highlights. Mike Bird points out that the hapax legoma tend to be words that are determined by subject matter and under the conscious control of the writer. Mounce's analysis of all the hapax legoma in the pastoral epistles confirms this proposition and demonstrates that the unique words are easily accounted for by the historical situations involved. And Greek lexicographer Bill Mounce explains not only were these epistles intended for Timothy and Titus, but they were probably meant to be read for the whole church as well. There are no other epistles with this dual purpose and would have to have some impact on the diction employed. And lastly, Thomas Oden emphasizes the pastorals contain Hebraisms, metaphors, and wordplay, all those are important, found in all the writings of Paul. And examples: 1 Timothy 6:5-6, 2 Timothy 2:9-3-4. And one last thing here: the dating. I just want to get that real quickly addressed, and I'm going to hand it off to Jeff here. So Donald Guthrie and Duane Lifton state Timothy and Titus seem to have been written not long before Paul's death, perhaps the years between Paul's first and second Roman imprisonments, which is between 62 and 68 AD. So there's two scholars right there, but I would love to get into Jeff with this, the background on the second imprisonment, because the second imprisonment would obviously show that these pastoral epistles are between 62 and 68 AD. Let's see here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and hand off to Jeff now, and thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Praise. That was got to 5 minutes. So, Jeff, if you want to throw a 5-minute rebuttal at Praise's opening statement, and then we will move into the back and forth. You can hear me okay, Jeff?
Apologies, I forgot to unmute myself.
Yeah, I've done that twice already tonight. So, Praise went 5 minutes, man. We'll give you a 5 minute if you can rebut his opening statement, and then we'll move to back and forth.
Sure, okay. So in Praise's opening statement, he said that 1 Timothy is universally accepted. That is not quite accurate, at least not in terms of like word usage. It's traditionally accepted within the church because the church has established that and asserted that 1 Timothy is, something that Paul wrote. it is not universally accepted in the sense that scholars agree. In fact, the consensus now, the modern scholarly consensus, is that Paul didn't write the pastoral epistles. So claiming that it's universally accepted is not really an accurate claim. One can say that it is traditionally accepted. That is true. Referring to Acts, going into the book of Acts and trying to refer to that as being, and using that as a way of trying to bolster any kind of historical facts about Paul, is fraught with a lot of problems, mostly because Paul and the author of Acts disagree on a lot of stuff. There's a lot of huge contradictions between the 7 undisputed letters of Paul and the book of Acts. The biggest one being, where does Paul go after the Damascus Road experience? Luke describes the situation, and then Paul immediately goes to Jerusalem to confer with the apostles. In the book of Galatians, Paul is writing to them in his letter, and there were suspicions that he was just delivering sort of a pat message or something like that from Jerusalem, from the other apostles. And he makes the bold claim that his ministry, his message, comes directly from God, and as proof of that, as support, it's because after the Damascus Road experience and Jesus' revelation to him, he went to Arabia. He avoided Jerusalem. He went to Arabia and studied on his own, and it wasn't for, there was quite a long time, I think something like 3 years or something. Afterward, he then ends up escaping, I believe he's living in the Nabatean kingdom. He ends up escaping that area, and then at some point closely after that, he meets with Peter, and then he meets some of these other apostles. So from Paul's own writings, he contradicts Luke's statements. So there are some issues about, and that's only one big issue. That's one of the bigger contradictions. That's not the only issue that comes up when talking about how Luke describes Paul and how Paul describes himself. As far as the salutations and benedictions, those aren't really proof against fraud, because you'd expect that anybody who's attempting to write a letter as if they were Paul is probably going to have access to how he wrote and try to mimic the style. So the easiest way to do that is to say, "Hi, I'm Paul," and to end it in a similar fashion. 1st and 2nd Timothy do have slightly different benedictions than some of the other letters, and they actually match each other pretty closely. So that's actually been cited by scholars as being proof that those were in fact written by the same person, but not Paul. 1 Philippians 1:1. It is true that the terms overseers and deacons are used. In 1 Philippians, that's the only undisputed letter where both are used. And then you start hearing it in 1 Timothy. He uses it again. The problem is he's using the same Greek words, but they're being used in a different context. In 1 Philippians, he's saying, I believe it's diakonos and episkopos. Those are basically helper and supervisors. By the time you move on to 1 Timothy, what we're talking about is something very different. He's talking about the appointing of people into an official church position, and even mentions that one of the primary requirements for these positions should be that the men are married and then of good moral standing in the community. So a little bit of an issue there, because you can see there's, at the very least, there's an evolution in Paul's thinking, which is different because Paul believed that Jesus was coming back in his lifetime. And now all of a sudden he's talking about the long-term church organization. Let's see. The other thing, 1 Timothy authorship was motivated secularly, I think, is kind of an unusual claim. One of the first times this popped up, and I'll actually bring up the reference here, one of the first times we have written proof of this was in 1807. It was from a German scholar named Friedrich Schleiermacher. He was a very important Christian theologian of the 19th century. He was famous for defending the Christian faith against its, quote, cultured despisers. He influenced distinct theological views that influenced other theologians well into the 20th century. He pointed out to a colleague that he believed that 1 Timothy was not written by Paul. This was coming from a relatively conservative Christian believer who's a theologian and a philosopher. So yeah, other than that, I think that kind of wraps it up for now. I guess we can move on to the other section.
Yeah, that's pretty much, he has been very cordial, very equal and opposite. And what we'll do is we will move on. I will give praise, seeing as he's pushing the affirmative. I will give praise, the first, we'll go 15 minutes. We'll give praise awesome. 15 minutes to lead the questioning. And Jeff, if you can give answers. And then we'll swap around and go after that. Okay. Yeah, it's 0035. So, praise, you've got the 0050.
Awesome. So this is my question to Jefferson. See, if we were to find the hallmarks of Paul, we would expect to see things like blasphemer, murderer, and things like violent man. So those alludances in 1 Timothy 12 through 14, do you agree that they do align with Pauline authorship there, or at least his character, that his profile? Would you agree with that?
To some extent. I don't know that simply referencing those really adds. I don't think it does much of anything. It either adds to or takes away from a notion of a claim of Pauline authorship.
Yeah, I guess my point is that it's consistent, though, and we're looking for consistency in these epistles that show correlation between Paul. Yeah, and here's another. This is also voiced in Acts 7:58, in Acts 9:1 through 2, where it shows that he was stoning Stephen and continually brought believers to death. So that there is a direct correlation with that. So I would like you would dismiss that, you would say, or you don't think that's irrelevant to the authorship?
I don't think that really goes one way or the other, because anybody that was that, to me, that's no different than somebody being able to copy a style at least a little bit, or copying, being able to hit certain trends. Which, if somebody's going to attempt to imitate someone in writing, they're going to get at least some common themes in there. Notions of his past as a persecutor of the Christian church. It's easy enough to drop a reference to that. So
my other follow-up question to that is, where in church history is impersonators ever accepted in part of the canon, in part of the canonicity, in the I would say in Trent, Trent.
Well, I don't know in terms of how it regards Trent, but 1st and 2nd Peter are not. Those are forgeries. Those were not written by Peter. There's no way they could have been. He spoke Aramaic. He was an illiterate fisherman from from that region of the world. He did not speak Hebrew. Did not read and write Hebrew or Greek. If they had something like night class that he could have gotten to, where he managed to learn not only how to read the Septuagint but how to write in Koine Greek rhetoric, maybe just before he managed to pick that up before he died. Yeah, but that's not really a likely explanation. So it's 1st and 2nd Peter are a pretty good example, not only that they're willing to accept something that has questionable authorship, but it's blatantly forged. Also, the idea that consider that Hebrews was brought into the canon because they decided that it must be written by Paul. It's not controversial even for conservative Christians to acknowledge that Hebrew is anonymous. That didn't used to be the case. And so even when you have issues like that, plus the idea that the early church fathers were the ones that assigned the names to the Gospels. The Gospels were not written by those apostles. Those names were selected for those Gospels. So
right. So I guess my only problem with that Peter's a whole nother animal to engage with. So I would maybe like to stick to Timothy and Pauline apostles here. So do you have any evidence where Pauline epistles were other instances where they were accepted or imitated, where hey, look, there's an instance here where maybe people want to shoehorn in a little bit of Paul here, or try to smuggle it in there? Do you have any more evidence of that?
Oh, well, there were the attempts obviously made with the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and there was a third letter to the Corinthians. They didn't make it, but they were circulated for a while. Eventually they were, for various reasons, they were ruled out. In terms of for other evidence, you could kind of point to theological inconsistencies within the books of Ephesians and Colossians with the undisputed letters. Mostly because specifically Ephesians kind of contradicts some of Paul's core theological message. At least it contradicts stuff that Paul wrote specifically to the First Corinthians about, and actually gives the opposite message. So, yeah.
I think
as well.
Yeah, I think the key word is they did not accept that, though. I think that was the key point there. In some of these other points,
hang on. They didn't accept what?
These pseudepigraphical works by Paul. They were rejected.
Right, but if the scholars are correct, they accepted 6 of them.
Well, I mean, you gave some examples, right? The third epistle of Paul was rejected. So we see, it's not like the church fathers were ready to accept any letter and just bring it on in. We don't see that.
Well, I'm not making that claim.
Okay. So, right. So, but I guess the follow-up question to that is, do you have any evidence that the church fathers or these people that are deciding what is Pauline that is accepted, do you have any evidence that they used a fraudulent process or a invalid process that should be not accepted?
No, and I don't think that's really germane to this topic. I haven't really gotten into the whether it was the apostolic fathers or afterward that really wrestled with it. I'm sure they all did, but they weren't the only ones that disputed the accuracy of those. The only problem is that the accuracy that was most famously called into question came from people that the church labeled heretics. So no one really took their criticism seriously. They still don't. So if you mention that, Marcion's own copy of the New Testament, what he believed to be the Bible, only included 10 letters from Paul, he left the pastorals out. He didn't think those were Pauline. But, the church was like, well, it doesn't matter what Marcion says because he's a heretic. Well, actually, if you look into what Marcion wrote about it, you see his reasons for why. He doesn't make it, not all of the points that he makes are bad. So it's not to say that this wasn't ever brought up then. As far as whether or not the church in those times made mistakes, I don't expect. I'm not. It's not even important to really suggest that the early church was out to deceive people, or they were dubious, or they were duped, or they goofed up. None of that really matters. If they believed that those were written by Paul and they acted accordingly, great. But it doesn't change the fact that modern scholarship shows that these were probably not written by Paul, and they got it wrong.
Yeah, I would like to address each claim by claim by claim. I think that's important, not to just jump to a shotgun of claims in one time, because that's obviously hard to tackle in one time. So maybe we could tackle one of these but your claim with Marcion,
halfway, Priest, you're halfway.
Okay, so do you have any scholars that give any credence to Tatian or Marcion, that they're when they were interpreting these letters or epistles by Paul, do you have anything that gives credence to them, or any type of citation for that?
A specific citation, not out of anything that I've read. I mean, I could probably dig one out, but without reviewing it, that really wouldn't be fair. In terms of the only thing that I could say is that based in general information that I've pulled based on either of them, and more so Marcion than Tatian, because I've encountered more references to him in my brief studies on this issue specifically, is that he obviously disagreed with it on his disagreement was on almost entirely on theological grounds. Where that gets questionable is that he was a Docetist, obviously, so he's a little wacky. But for him, there is something to be said that perhaps these things were being accepted by the church precisely for the same reason, because they do harmonize relatively well with the other books, and they were written, within the first century of the church. Everything that ended up in the canon, I don't think anything is dated after the first century, and everything's supposed to be from an apostle. So.
And my last question is the blessing. See, there is a calling card that's a scholar. I can give you his name. Let's see here, Stephen. Oh man, I forgot. I don't have his name right now, but he does cite that the salutation here, the blessing, grace, and peace, perfectly fits Paul's his style with all his other epistles, Pauline epistles. So how would you address that?
As evidence of a particularly good forger.
Okay, yeah, but
it's in the style, but it's not. I mean, first of all,
right.
the salutations and even the closings aren't identical for most of them. But even with those, I mean, I've never really understood this. I know that a lot of people get into the wording of this, but a lot of it seems to me to be like an extrapolation on, just an extension of the argument that's made by the guy that who did the Southern Seminary video that you included in your list of citations, which was, well, first of all, Paul says he wrote it. Well, that's fantastic, but you essentially, by saying that, you're just assuming, like, I want you to assume at least a slight position of credulity, and just acknowledge the fact that this letter says it was written by Paul. Well, great. The only problem with that is the inconsistencies that pop up within that. So the salutations aside, the thing to me is that it seems to be as evidence of the letters themselves. If they struck people today, back then, the way they kind of strike people today, I would expect someone copying Paul to get that. And even in that case, I mean, the language is general enough. That's not hard to put on there. You and I could sign off on emails today and use and slightly change the wording, but basically nail a Pauline salutation or even a benediction. So I'm not convinced by that.
So do you have any other examples of that where this has been an issue, where there has been forgeries of these salutations in the church, or even, well, you could even say in any other instances, I'll even accept that in the Greek culture.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, like I said, there was enough evidence of forgery. Like I said, Galen as the physician, that's only one example that I gave, but there was enough. I mean, because you obviously didn't mass-produce books back then. You wrote one and you sent it off. So if somebody made a forgery, they had the one version that was getting circulated around. Galen had to deal with this often enough because he had somebody that was copying him that was accurate enough that people thought it was actually him. And so he ended up composing his own book that was an instruction manual for his readers and fans. Hey, want to know if it's genuinely for me or a pretty decent, fake? Read this. Now, Galen's slightly different in that he's actually putting something together that I think is more meant to be written, it's not meant to be written as a letter, but it's meant to be written as some kind of narrative or description or something like that, or instructions. But in Paul's case, he's writing letters.
Well, let me respond to that real quick. Well, Paul in 2 Thessalonians says, these are the conditions under how I write these letters. This is my style, and this is what you're not supposed to accept. So why would Paul tell people how his style of writing and his salutations per se, why would he warn people of that? And then how would that work in your viewpoint?
Well, he specifically brings it up as a way of saying, oh, by the way, there's these things out there that get circulated that might be fake, so be careful what you trust, kind of thing.
2 minute warning. 2 minute warning.
My claim to that, the claim that a lot of modern scholars think, in terms of the way that's written, that's used as a verisimilitude. It's used to make it seem like, okay, well, the best way to tell people, to make it seem genuine, is to let them know, by the way, this is the real deal. And the easiest way, rather than just come right out and say baldly, this is a genuine letter, I'm not lying to you. The easiest thing to do is like, just in case any of you were wondering, there's fake letters circulating out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This one's not. This is the real deal. So that would be my answer to that. There's nothing to say that based on any of the works that I've seen from 2 Thessalonians, it's just as likely it's a verisimilitude as some kind of.
So lastly, so I'm going to add, this will be the last part of this. So do you well, that kind of shows it wasn't arbitrary. There wasn't an arbitrary process where someone just accepts forgeries. I just don't see that, and even you acknowledge this with Paul's in his own writing in Thessalonians. So I think it becomes a conspiracy theory at that point. That's why it should not be accepted. I don't
think it's not about being arbitrary, but
perfect. Yeah, that's bang on. You've like 15 seconds left, so that's 100%.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll give those to Jefferson. Go ahead.
What we can do is we do have one question that has popped up during that. I'll hit it in the private chat. If you can see it, it's a question for both. If Jeff, if you can answer first, and then we'll go praise, and I'll bounce over then to Jeff taking control.
Okay. Who did you want tackling the question first? For
Jeff, you go first, man.
Okay. Yeah, the secretary hypothesis is frequently brought up, and it used to be a pretty common one. It still is. The idea is there's a couple different ways of approaching it, and there's some scholars that have done more work on this than others. So the general idea is if Paul's using a scribe, and he does mention that he has used scribes in some of his books, he mentions one specifically for Romans. Is the scribe just taking dictation? Are they writing down the words of the person themselves and getting them as close as possible? Or is the scribe being brought in to act as sort of an editor? Or are they being brought in to sort of contribute to stylistic differences or changes? The evidence because there's at least 2, maybe 3 instances in the undisputed Pauline letters that Paul mentions that he's using scribes, and his style is similar enough in those where scholars don't see that if he was using a scribe, it didn't change the style enough to make them think that, this is really coming from a different person. The other thing is that there's a little bit of an anachronism there, the idea of, it's actually sort of a vagary. Is this person a scribe taking dictation, or is this person something more like what we would think of as a ghostwriter? I've got this idea, and I can kind of get the big ideas out. I need this writer to kind of help me flesh it out and get it on the page and help with the narrative and the prose or whatever. That part right there, I think, is really hard to justify. It's easy, it's easier to take it, and based on what they know about the first century back then, most people that used scribes use them for dictation. The reason I don't think that that's particularly accurate either is because claims that are made to defend certain theological concepts in 1 Timothy are based on the idea that Paul was being very, very specific in his vocabulary and very specific in the types of ideas he's trying to generate. But the defense in general, like, well, maybe we see these stylistic differences because the secretary came in and changed the writing style. That's an appeal to imprecise language usage. But then they turn around and say, no. If you actually take a look at this very different theological concept, like women gaining salvation through giving birth, this language was used just this way and so. Well, now you're making an argument. Again, you believe that there's a secretary involved, but now you're appealing to the precise usage of language. So I think at that point, those two claims end up becoming getting at odds with each other, and you sort of end up in the same dilemma that you did when you started. So yeah, I think it's not controversial to assume that Paul did use scribes, but it's a reach to say that the scribes were somehow so significantly changing the writing that's the grounds for the differences that scholars see and why they think the pastorals and the Deuteropauline epistles are not from Paul.
Well, that's 3 minutes. Praise. I'll give you the exact same time if you want to answer the question. Go on ahead.
Yeah, I've looked into the secretary hypothesis, and I'm saying it does have a little bit of credence to it. There are scholars who give validation for that. I do have the citations, but there's somewhere else. I have in my notes somewhere, but they think they call it. I forget the exact name or how they address it. I think it was like an aphorensis or something like that. They give the official name. I forgot the
amanuensis.
Yeah, amanuensis. Yeah. So that does seem plausible, but I don't hold to that theory. And I think the works done by Mounts and some of these other lexicographers show we don't really need to go down that route because the hapax logoma, and we can see that completely overturns these other theories of pseudepigrapha. So I'll just leave it there. But if anyone wants, I could give citations for that. But that's not where I was going with it, though.
Right. Well, that puts us at the halfway point between the back and forth. If I can just do a quick summary, and still man me if I'm wrong. or shout at me if I'm wrong, but I think Jeff is trying to put across the point of forgeries, timing, going back and forth. I know the praise has pointed out a few things that are individual and to that point, but overall as a whole, if you take everything into account, and the fact that Paul, had that specific, this is what's true, that I think is Jeff's point. And that's the back. So Jeff, I will bounce over to yourself and I will give you control for 15 minutes if you want to ask praise and poke and push them buttons.
Okay. So I'm not sure how much else you've ever looked into this particular issue then. But I guess the first one would be, how would you, as an establishment question, are you aware of some of the other areas of, not really apologetics, but there's some scholarly work to kind of explain away some of the differences in the Pauline epistles, the pastoral epistles? Yes.
They goes into a lot of things with the church, how to keep up the church, and with deacons and things like that. I know the argument from the skeptics is, well, this is even Paul was way before that. And my answer to that is, well, you can't necessarily dismiss these letters by Paul because, to pastors and things like that, because of the Gentile movement. Paul would have to, and I can give a citation for this actually. Let's see here. I'll have to find it here in a second. But he explains that Paul would have to bring these type of epistles out because of the Gentile movement and the explosion of Gentiles. And that's just one example, but if I can go into more as well, reasons why these pastoral epistles fit well within the paradigm or the timeline of Paul.
Okay. So I guess that being said, then, how do you think that jives with, especially in 1 Timothy, because he's now talking to this, the head of this church, and he's sort of giving, instructions on how this should be organized and how it should be set up. How do you think his view on women in that one corresponds to the way that he states them? I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about women preaching and being, or at least teaching and prophesying.
Yeah, that's a great question, Jefferson. And I guess my answer might be a little bit unorthodox on this, and I would say that they're misconstrued. A lot of these organizations, church organizations, and seminaries even, they approach these as misogynistic, and I can understand that from a prima facie coming at these texts with prima facie attitude. But if you do a little bit of investigation in the Greek, it kind of it gets rid of the obscurity what's going on here, and these texts is actually saying that women should not chatter, and just like men should not chatter and things like that. You're not supposed to interrupt a service, and that's all Paul's saying there. Yeah, I guess that could be problematic for many evangelicals if they don't do the Greek work on that. If you want me to, I can expound upon that if you want me to, but that's what I have to say about that right now.
Yeah, because the way it ends up getting portrayed, the author ends up going into a description about how Adam was not the first to be deceived, but Eve was, and Eve, in so doing, she deceived Adam, and in this way she became a transgressor. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on to say that by bearing children she shall be saved. Before that, it then talks about how she will learn in silence and be submissive to her husband. My concern at this, in trying to read into this, is not to apply some kind of idea of modern day misogyny to that issue. My issue is that does not seem to square with Paul's idea, at least presented in the 7 undisputed letters, of what he thinks the church is. He seems to be treating the church as if it's sort of loosely organized. People who are saved are granted a gift by the Holy Spirit, and there's 9 of them. I believe that's right, 9 of them, and you get your gift, and you're able to contribute to the church and help it grow and help other believers. But at the end of the day, all of this is basically so that they're getting ready for the resurrection. Their resurrection. They're waiting for Jesus to come back, and Paul believes that it's happening in his lifetime. He will see Jesus come back before he dies.
Right.
That does not seem to gel with then talking about women should learn in silence, and they will be saved through bearing children. That is totally different than what he was talking about before.
Yeah, and I can understand that perspective if on a very shallow type of approach to these texts. I understand that interpretation, but if you do a little bit of investigate, a little bit of research in exegesis on 1 Timothy 2, there was these Gnostic heresies that were teaching all the way back with there was a different woman at this time. I forget her name now. It was a Gnostic heresy that she was the one that brought in sin to the world or something. I forget the exact.
I think you're referring to Lilith.
Lilith, yeah. There was with Lilith heresies, and this is what Paul was. He was addressing these type of heresies there, and what he was saying that women, you can't just blurt out and chatter and make this. Actually, if you look at the Greek word, it means like make animal noises. Actually, from if there's a Greek, his name is Kittle. Kittle is a Greek manuscript or lexicographer, Greek manuscript. He's very well known in Greek manuscriptology, if you want to call it that, or your textual criticism. And he shows that this actually means animal noises. Women were doing all sorts of weird things back then, and Paul was actually forced to address these things. And then, so I think it does show a little bit of that in the beginning of 1 Timothy if you read through the context.
Okay, but even if that's the case, even if one were to dig into the meaning of it and say that that's what's happening, why is Paul now suggesting that women achieve salvation through bearing children?
I have to look at that passage. Do you have that passage on hand? I mean, look at that real quick.
I believe it's 1 Timothy 2, verses 8 through 15. I think it's verse 15.
Okay.
If I can just say in the silence, we've got 9 minutes to the questions and answers section. So if anybody's got any questions, if they want to throw it out, make sure to tag me. Gavin's question, Jay, has been seen. It's been posted in the private chat. Tag me for questions. I'll post them in the private chat for us. And when we get to the end, we will go on ahead. So, praise, another 10 minutes. Or, sorry, Jeff, another 10 minutes. Go on ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think commentaries are, pretty... there's so many available out there for people to check out. It's not hard to find. But I mean, my first commentary in childbearing. This is a citation from John Gill's exposition of the Bible, and he says, this is to be understood not to be a temporal salvation or being saved through childbearing through the perilous time and being delivered out of it. For this is generally the case, yet not always, nor always the case of good women. Rachel died in childbed. The Jews say for 3 transgressions women die in childbearing, because they do not take care of their menstrues and the cake of the first fruits of the lighting of the lamp, and etc. So I think commentaries address this stuff, but I haven't really checked into it. But I think that's sufficient for right now.
Okay, but yeah, I think it still makes things kind of difficult for, especially. I mean, I know that a lot of early believers, especially women, will look at this and be like, "Well, Paul's a jerk." I like to use it as an example of like, no, Paul may not be a jerk because Paul maybe didn't write this. Yeah. Other than that, there was another question I was going to ask about. In terms of like canonicity of it, have you ever run across anything, especially, I can't remember where I saw this, but issues where people had raised the idea that at least First Timothy, possibly all three pastoral epistles, were written by Polycarp?
Yes, I did see allusions to that in someone's commentaries, but that's an interesting viewpoint. Yes, I did see that, and that is, I mean, I'm open to that possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, because I noticed that one of the things that you had brought up, one of the sources, I think it was the one from Bible.org, it was cited by Polycarp, and it's like, well, Polycarp may have written it.
Yeah.
Or at least he was alleged to have written it, and then the other one was Clement. But the problem with Clement was that First Clement, scholars don't know for a fact that Clement actually wrote it, and even if he did, First Clement, I mean, he does cite First Timothy. He cites quite a few other things in there, quite a few other Pauline epistles, but he doesn't call them scripture.
Right.
He does not attribute them as being scripture, so probably a little too early for that. But yeah, I can't think of any questions right now off the top of my head, but I'm sure more will come up as we discuss certain things. So I'm willing to cede the rest of my time if we want to move into a question and answer phase.
Well, you should have given me 10, 15 minutes of notice there to let people know, because it's not like I have told them and they haven't given me any fucking questions. But we've got one. We've got one in the private chat there from Gavin. If we're going to move to the questions and answers, people start pumping them out. Tag me in the chat. I will move them on to Jeff and Praise. So there is one from Gavin if you want to address that. This time we will go with Praise first.
Awesome. Lay it on me, the question. Let's see. I don't see where it is.
Chat? Did I not post it in the freaking private chat?
No, it's down there.
Oh, wait a minute. Okay. So question for both. A book to make it into the New Testament canon had to meet three criterions: apostolicity, orthodoxy, and Catholicity. First Timothy passed these demands with flying colors. Yes or no? Yes, I do. And I think I give several reasons in my opening why that is the case. And it passed a rigorous process of our church fathers in the Council of Trent and some other and out throughout history. You can go through all the different explanations, why that they're probably corrupted or something. But to me, it just goes into conspiracy land, and I think it requires a little bit of a burden of proof on the one making the claim that to show that either they were incompetent or they were operating under false pretenses or something like that. That the burden's on the one that's on them. And I think there's other things that are congruent with him as well. And like I mentioned, the Hebraisms and his styles. I think the style is still there, even though that is contended. And unfortunately, I couldn't go too much into that because it'd just be mostly me talking. But yeah, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Jeff.
Jeff, if you would like to address that from Gavin, for a book to make it into the New Testament canon, it had to meet three criterions: apostasy, orthodoxy, and Catholicity. First Timothy passed demands with flying colors. Yes or no?
I don't know how easy it was for it to get in there, because like I said, I haven't gotten in my study of this. I haven't totally gotten into like how much back and forth happened with the early church fathers over, how the pastoral epistles ended up getting included. What I would say though is that if you read the pastoral epistles, there's nothing really in them other than some of these bigger issues, especially like I've mentioned before, chapter 2, verses 8 through 15, that kind of throw up some red flags, and some of these issues about church organization and stuff. There's nothing in them that I think the church would really find all that objectionable, especially if they're trying to establish like a corpus, and if they're looking to include something in the canon. The grounds for how they end up including that, I don't know if they really matter all that much. The idea that something like this could be traditionally held to is different than, say, something, if you're trying to make a claim about whether or not it is actually accurate, right? Like, again, this is traditionally held to be attributed to Paul, but the majority of scholars that work in this field, many of them who are believers, don't accept that. So there are lots of reasons for that. They get and it's a huge issue. The only thing I'm a layperson, so the only thing I know are sort of the generals and sort of the shotgun approach to like the issues that they bring up, and this is how they do their best to communicate it to lay persons like myself. So I'm not getting into that particular minutia and trying to figure out, okay, well, how did the church get there, and what were the decisions they made? That makes for a fascinating study. The fact of the matter is they did include it, and now we're dealing with an issue where after the 19th century and going forward, experts in this field, overwhelmingly, I think there's only two really right now that are experts in this field that kind of defend Pauline authorship. The rest of them are like, no, it's not those three. The pastoral epistles are probably not written by him. So the church accepted it. They made them canon. Great. Did they get it wrong? I think they did.
Perfect. Next question. Slightly off topic, but we all have a lot of love for Brainbug, and Brainbug is a Patreon. The man pays me to be here, so I am definitely asking his question. What is your favorite dinosaur to both people?
Ooh, good question. Probably a pterodactyl. I would think the flying one was pretty cool.
We're going to get into a phrase of what is a dinosaur now, but Jeff, go on ahead.
I would probably go with I think it's a little later on, but I think it's pronounced Ankylosaurus. It kind of looks like a cross between like a badger and a tortoise. It has like a shell with spikes on it. It had this big club tail that it looks like it could break bones with. But it was a little vegetarian thing. It just kind of ran around. I thought they were kind of cute. When I was a kid, I was into dinosaurs, and that one always kind of appealed to me.
Oh yeah, I was the same man. I collected a magazine every month at far too much money to build a glow-in-the-dark T-Rex skeleton. We have a question from Jane Puss Seeker, if I pronounced that correctly. This question is directly for praise, and it is the passages about women. If women is infertile, back then the word is barren. Does that not mean she isn't saved?
No. Anything to do with your body, genetics, biology has never been pertinent to salvation. But it was maybe to their welfare. And this is why in slavery discussions that why people were bought in things, and this is why it was going on, because if they were just left out in the desert, they probably would die. They don't have no resources to hold on to. It was a pretty crazy atmosphere back then, and it's just the arid desert and things like that. But I think it's not pertinent to salvation. No.
Jeff, would you like to address that at all? I know it wasn't for you, but is there anything you would like to add to it?
Yeah, no, I am very curious about the implications of that particular phrase. I think it's weird that it's mentioned that bearing children is what women, that's how women get salvation. If that's being meant in some kind of, there's no real evidence that that's like some kind of metaphor or allegory, because there's nothing else in that letter that's quite like that. If I could get my hands on the original author, I'd be like, what is that? Because that's nowhere else in the New Testament, even not even just the Pauline epistles. You don't get that even out of the four Gospels. You don't even get anything that's that crazy out of Revelation. So I think there was an attempt to kind of establish a notion of sort of male primacy within the church hierarchy, and clearly that view that women would be saved through bearing children is predicated on the idea that Eve was to be blamed for the fall of man. So. Can
I just real quick respond to that? Are we allowed to do that?
Go ahead, man. Yeah. Throw a couple of minutes. Or go on. Throw a
Sure,
response.
Thank you. So I would respond back to say, well, maybe John 3 is actually an alludence to that. Jesus says, you must be born of the waters. So this is what many theologians, scholars over history have interpreted this passage to mean, must be born in the waters of woman to be saved. So maybe it's not as scarce as you think, or irrelevant, or if it's isolated. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's an alludence to John 3.
Perfect. Next question, if I can keep up with these goddamn questions, would be from Santi. What version of the Bible do you think is more accurate? He said to what Paul wrote. I'm going to rephrase it to what we believe Paul wrote. And I'll aim that at praise first.
That's a really good question. I say there is no one in particular. You have to do, you have to cross-reference all of them, and you have to use interlinears and parsing. You have to do your own scholarship on that. And to me, all translations are fallible and erroneous in some way. But it doesn't make them irrelevant. It just means that they're flawed, and you have to do your own work. So I would say there is none. In short.
Well, we know we know that Jeff disagrees that Paul wrote it, so yeah. From Benghazi, question for Jeff: why can't you get Bart Ehrman's name right in your sources?
Yeah, that's I corrected the spelling issues in that. Those spelling issues are coming from a file switch. I saved it from one PC to another, and it saved it into some kind of archival form. And for whatever reason, it gives you the whole thing. This may not get displayed the same. Well, the reason it doesn't get displayed the same is because it gets a little weird about names and decides to change some of them. And for whatever reason, it doesn't get highlighted in the review. It's weird. I've changed those 4 times. And anytime I save it and converted it, ended up getting stuck to that, because now it's Barth Ehrman. That's clearly not right. That's not what it looked like when I saved it. So.
Well, the chat is in live agreement that I'm allowed to go and run to the toilet, so I will ask the next question. Red Fang, for praise, can you show the proof that Paul was talking about women making animal noises?
Yes, it's Kittle's commentary. I can't open that up right now for you, but I can give you. I could just give you maybe the title of the book real quick. Just give me 1 second. And you can look it up yourself. Kittles. Let's see here. So it's called Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, Volume 1. And yes, it is a a concordance, but it does have a little bit of commentary in there. He adds his own notes and things, and it's $30. It's Gerard Kittle, and it has the word there silent, and it's like chatter, so you can look that up yourself. In fact, I have it on my channel. I could, if you want to check that out, Red, go to my channel. I'll show you can. Maybe I'll show it tonight. Who knows? Whatever you want me to do.
Perfect. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you all for the toilet break. The next question from...
I would like to say...
Oh, Jeff, sorry, go ahead, if you can add to that.
Yeah, sorry to step on your
last
statement there, but just getting into that question, I think if somebody's trying to say that what the author of 1 Timothy meant was to say it was chattering, that's not necessarily an argument against this particular author being misogynistic. They need to shut up because they don't need to be doing this. They need to be quiet and be subservient to a husband. So somebody could take that Kittle's reading, his translation in Koine Greek there, and kind of double down on claims of misogyny in that passage.
Yeah, well, I mean, Paul did do the same thing. He admonished men for doing the same thing. So I don't see any type of sexist thing there. But that's open to interpretation for each person.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I don't think it may not be indicative of some kind of worse behavior or something like that. It may actually just be indicative of the attitude the author has about women in general.
Okay, moving on to the next one. Jeff, your wonderful brother, mentioned someone claiming Paul was dead at the time of the Pastoral Epistles. Any expansion on that?
Sure. So yeah, there's traditionally it's held that Paul was probably put to death sometime just before the end of the reign of Nero, which would have been around 64 AD or so. People tend to kind of hold that maybe he was put to death around about the same time that Peter was. Peter was crucified first. So whether or not that date actually holds, whether the tradition is factually accurate and historically accurate, it does seem like he probably would have died, even if he hadn't been executed. He would have died of natural causes, given that most authors or most scholars now don't think that this particular these epistles were written in the 60s. They think they were actually written towards the end of the first century, so we're talking about probably late 80s into the 90s, or possibly even the early second century, because of the issues that they're dealing with, specifically with the reference to the Gnostic groups. Those Gnostic groups during the 60s, that would have been before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Those particular Gnostic groups, from my studies, really kind of grew and became much more influential later on in the first century. So him referring to that as a big issue for Timothy to deal with in the church seems a little anachronistic.
Praise, anything to add to that before we get to the last question?
Yeah, so Donald Guthrie and Dwayne Lifton, they're two scholars, and they state Timothy and Titus seem to have been written not long before Paul's death, perhaps the years between Paul's first and second Roman imprisonments, in which is between 62 and 68 or 68 AD. And we have support for a second imprisonment in Acts 28, but also Second Timothy goes into detail about this as well. And so we have a bunch of data, hard data, that shows there was a second imprisonment. So that it doesn't show he actually died. He actually went through a second imprisonment. I could expound upon this, but I don't want to just go off for another 10 minutes, and just have people just listen to me. So
yeah, you're not getting 10 minutes.
We don't have any real definitive dates for the pastoral epistles, so I don't think it's accurate to say, well, if it matches an account of a second imprisonment, it must have been at this time. That doesn't really follow. If somebody was knowledgeable enough, they could have written these stories. Again, if they're imitating Paul's style enough to copy his greetings and claim to be Paul, they likely would have had word of his different imprisonments and stuff. So at least that could kind of match up. So that's not the best evidence. Plus, Second Timothy seems like kind of like an abridged version of the first one, and it does describe his imprisonment, but yeah, I don't know that that's really all that convincing, and I don't know that. I haven't read from any other scholars that think that's a good argument for them being dated as early as the 60s. They still kind of cling to the idea that these were probably written closer to the end of the first century.
Perfect.
Yeah, well, okay.
Go on ahead, Praise, if you have a report for that. Go on ahead.
Yeah, so if you read Philippians 1:19, 25, 26, 2:24, and Philemon 22, it gives a time there, a date,
right,
where we can narrow in a time within the 60s. So Anthony Hansen, he expresses the evidence for release from his first imprisonment is found in Paul's expectation in the prison epistles. So we're not just whistling in the dark on this. We do have hard data. So, like I said, I wish I had more time.
But if that's supporting the idea of a second imprisonment, and it is in the 60s, and he died at some point right around that time, the Gnostic groups that he's talking about weren't really that influential at that time.
Right, but see, the Gnostics are not the Gnostics that you're thinking of. And Edwin Yamasuchi is a scholar who holds a traditional view of these heresies, or this type of Gnosticism was held in Judaism, not the traditional Gnosticism.
Well, okay, but those... Again, most of the scholars that have talked about this, have studied it, have shown that their influence increases at the end of the first century and into the beginning of the second century. So I don't know why it would matter if they're deriving. And here's the thing: the Gnostic groups are deriving stuff from their kind of sort of a Chinese menu approach to picking and choosing things from a burgeoning Christian faith and then combining that with some of them were even combining with ancient Hebrew mysticism. So
have you read Patrick
Just
Fairbairn?
If we can, Praise, if you want to make one more statement, and then we'll give Jeff one more statement.
I'll end it real quick here. So Patrick Fairbairn has a work on there, and he cites Ferdinand Bauer, says these are Gnostic teachings of Valentinius in his system of aeons, which confirms that this was a Gnosticism to the regular Gnosticism, but I'll end it there. Thank you.
Jeff, if you would like to make a final statement there on that topic, and then we'll bounce back and forth.
I can't really go. I can't remember who it was, but there actually has been some pushback on that claim from Bauer, but I just can't remember who the scholar was that talked about it. I think it's more recent. So,
Perfect.
I'd have to do some research on that to find it. So.
Thank you very much, Jeff. If I can say straight up, Jeff, thank you very much for coming here tonight. Praise, thank you very much for coming here tonight. I think it's been good discussion. I have not needed to get the flames out, which is, again, a little disappointing.
It is disappointing.
But I think...
I enjoyed the discussion with Jeff. It was a very enlightening discussion. He made me think about some of my arguments, and I appreciate that, Jeff.
Sure.
Stop being so fucking nice to each other. Right. We do have a full 6 slot for the after party. We have other people coming back. So, yeah, the after party link has been posted in the chat. If I can personally do a shout out again to Jeff and Praise and everybody watching, all my mods, I really do appreciate your help tonight and keeping track. And Patreons, as always, helping keeping the channel going. I've been out of work now for a couple of months, so anything you can do to help is much appreciated. We will see you back in maybe 10-15 minutes. Everybody can go get a sandwich, take a piss. And yeah, on that note, we will... oink, and we will out.
All right. Thank you.
If I can.
Later. Thank you.